We don't need that in there. And we're just here. Okay, so let me start over again. All right, this is Sue Bola with the Serious Game Association. As you know, we do these webinars as a preview to our annual conference and some of the great content from the speakers. So I hope that you'll be able to join us this year or next year. And now I'm just going to turn it over to Randy. Go ahead.
Hi, Sue. Thanks for turning it over to me, and I'm glad to be here to talk about our topic today, which is using popular video games to improve executive functions and social emotional learning skills. I think before I start talking, I want to just tell you a little bit about how I got interested in this and sort of my background, because I think it'll help to explain why this information is really so important for us to be considering. So I'm a child clinical psychologist, been in practice for about 30 years, work with lots of kids with learning and attentional problems, kids with what we call executive functioning difficulties, kids with depression and anxiety, and kids with just modest difficulties in school. And one of the things that I've learned over the course of the last 20 years or so is how engaged and involved kids are with technology. They absolutely love technology. Kids who are failing at virtually everything else in their life are the leaders in their households around fixing technology, around playing games, around teaching their parents how to use cell phones. It's a remarkable tool for these kids. And what I've learned is that these kids really not only have an expertise with this, but have a great interest, a great engagement, and they're learning from it. And so I've spent much of the last 15 years working on some strategies of taking the kinds of things that kids are doing with games and apps and translating it to skills for the real world. And one of the real issues that I'll talk about today that I think is really important is how do we take this sort of game-based learning and make it into real-world learning? How do we actually engage in this process of transferring what you do in a game to the real world? And I think this is a really important thing for us to consider when we look at how do we use games to help kids, and for that matter, adults. So one of the things we know is that kids learn from their play. I mean, play is really the way that young children learn. In fact, one of the concerns that many educators have these days is that we're taking play away from kids. In kindergartens, they're no longer going out for recess. They're not engaged in imaginative play. There's too much of an emphasis oftentimes on teaching academics. And psychologists have been very interested in play and learning. I would like to say that we're the leaders in kind of saying that play equals learning in kids. It's the way that kids have always learned. Play is a tool for socialization. It's to know who your friends are, to know how to get along with others. When I was a young kid, one of the ways that I learned to learn from my play is playing checkers with my grandmother. My grandmother could beat me very easily, but she didn't. She kind of taught me how to prepare for it. Oh, that's a double jump there, to kind of look ahead, to think of the future, to use some planning skills. Play is how kids learn to express themselves. That's how they learn to restrain their impulses. It helps them to take perspectives. Play is an opportunity to practice for adult roles, to whether that be in many societies, play is an opportunity to follow in your mother or father's footsteps in terms of what you do. So it's a great opportunity for learning. And it's also an opportunity to practice what psychologists refer to as executive functions and social emotional learning skills. I'll describe those in a little bit more detail later. Most of the time, when people think about play and learning, they go back and they think about it from a traditional standpoint. They say, well, unstructured play leads to learning, or creative play leads to learning, or playing board games with your parents leads to learning. And people have been very quick to discount the use of video games and technology as a tool for learning. But in fact, the data suggests that digital play is an incredibly powerful tool for learning. And we have leaders in the field like James Paul G. and Kurt Squire, organizations such as Serious Play and the Games for Change, Games for Health. These organizations are all taking the lead to kind of take a look at how can games and play, video games and play, lead to learning. So this slide that you're seeing right now is of a really great YouTube video, and I would encourage you, if you want to watch a very short, I think it's maybe about a 4-minute video about games and learning. It's really funny. It talks about some of the science that I'll be talking about today, in this presentation, and it's also something that you can kind of give to parents or educators who don't quite buy into this. And it's a pretty powerful, well-made video. So kind of wanted to make sure that people were aware of this. So, video games are great for learning all kinds of specific things. Okay, certainly in schools now we know how much video games and technology are involved in academics. There's some tremendous data that suggests that kids can learn so much from these games and technology in terms of reading, math fluency, and any kind of topical area, whether that's learning about history. I mean, kids learn about history playing games like Civilization, for example. They're learning about geology and math, for that matter, when they're playing Minecraft. Games are great for teaching cognitive skills. Okay, what we know is that playing certain types of action-based video games can increase processing speed. People can actually learn to think more quickly and effectively. Games are great for job-related skills. Okay, developing skills for surgery, military functioning. There's some great data that describes how people who play World of Warcraft, who take leadership roles in World of Warcraft, actually make better leaders in the real world. A real good study about that in the Harvard Business Review that you might want to look at. Games like playing. Even there's a study that Daphne Bavalia and Sean Green did on action-based games, including Grand Theft Auto 3, one of the older versions, and Medal of Honor, that described how it could help with selective attentional skills. And we also know that games can practice and help improve social emotional functions, so social skills and self-awareness, and what we call executive functions, these kind of self-management skills that are brain-based skills, and they can improve skills such as cognitive flexibility and sustained focus. So here I want to cite a little bit of the research. This is not just people who are kind of saying, well, we see some improvements, but this is pretty good data. The Green and Bavalia have done a series of studies, for those of you who are interested to look at, where they look at a variety of action-based games and how they can improve processing speed, attentional issues, certain types of selective attention, and can improve other kinds of processing skills. Working memory skills, that's an interesting one. So there's a product called CogMed Working Memory Training. Some people may have heard of it. It's actually owned by the Pearson Corporation, the large publisher. So Pearson developed CogMed Working Memory probably about 2001 is when it came out. And Torkel Klingberg, a researcher in Sweden, is really responsible for it. What they found is a series of short video games that work to improve both verbal and visual spatial working memory. There have been, at this point, I want to guess approximately 75 peer-reviewed studies that demonstrate how playing this video game, if you will, a set of video games, can improve working memory skills. And working memory is the capacity to hold information in mind as you're doing something. So it's really important for kids who are doing like a math word problem, where they hear the problem, they have to hold information, then they have to perform an operation. They have to work on what they've heard. Or working memory plays a huge role in reading comprehension. Or I like to tell adults, working memory is when we go to walk to the refrigerator, and then we stand in front and we say, what the reason I was here? Be careful with my language here, but why am I here? Because you can't remember what it is. You went to work on a memory that you had and to do something about it. But what we know now is that certain kinds of video games can actually improve that. There's some studies that suggest, for example, that cut the rope. A very fun, simple game can improve problem solving and executive functions. Okay, there's a study done in New Zealand on a game called Sparks, and I might have to spell that for those of you who are not used to the Rhode Island accent. That's SPARX, actually, which is kind of a cognitive behavioral game to reduce depression in kids. And again, effective. So we're seeing all these kinds of things. We're also seeing a number of studies that suggest how playing certain kind of video games can actually thicken and improve brain functioning in certain parts of the brain that are important. A couple of other studies here that are really interesting to me. A study done in Italy showed that playing the game Rayman Raving Rabbits for just a brief amount of time can improve reading fluency skills more so than training kids in reading for about 20 hours. So again, games are having very positive effects on kids. Now, there's also some negative effects as well, and things that we should think about. You can see here in the slide concerns such as obesity. There is some data around violence that's very controversial. My own sense when I look at the data as a whole is that if you have a trait or a trait tendency towards being violent, then you are more likely to be violent if you play violent video games. But it doesn't actually increase actual real-world violence in kids who are playing video games. Video game addiction is a big issue. For those of you who are going to look at this shortly, just recently, the last 2 weeks in July, there have been a couple of very interesting articles about video game addiction in the New York Times, widely cited. They're being sent all over the world. I mean, and there's some real serious concerns. Less so in the United States than in other parts of the world. South Korea is a place, for example, and much of Southeast Asia has very high levels of video game addiction. So these are real-world issues. Probably the best study that looks at kind of the negative impact about video games in kids is a study recently done by Andrew Shabilsky out of Oxford, where he found that actually playing video games for 1 hour a day is actually more helpful for kids and healthier for kids than kids who play video games for more than 3 hours a day. Well, and that sort of makes sense if you think about it. It's like, yeah, if you're playing video games for 3 hours a day, you're probably spending an awful lot of time in front of the screen. And it's probably not just 3 hours, but many hours. However, the Shabilsky data was also suggested that playing video games for 1 hour a day was actually healthier than if you didn't play at all. And to me, that makes perfect sense. In today's world, kids play games. This is how they play. This is what they do. This is how they get together with their friends. This is how they talk to each other. They need to go to school and talk about the games they play. I was just working with a kid in my office the other day who said to me one of the things that they do is he was a 13-year-old kid and playing Call of Duty. I have some concerns about that, but goes home from school and plays Call of Duty with a bunch of the kids in his class. And the next day at school, they go and sit at lunch, and they talk to them about it. It's connecting them. So playing for an hour a day gives you that opportunity for connection as well as all the cognitive challenges that we know go on with video games. So there's a lot of things that you can learn from games and technology. You can learn to socialize, as we can see in this slide. This is actually a slide from one of my books, and I wrote a book called Playing Smarter in a Digital World. That's really it's really a guide for parents around how can they use technologies to help their kids learn these executive functioning and other kinds of skills. So let's talk about a couple of the skills that I want to be addressing today. Now, again, I'm a psychologist. I'm not a teacher. So I'm really interested in these sort of psychological and emotional skills. So I'm going to be talking about two types of skills that as I describe them, you're going to say, they sound like they're in many ways the same. And in fact, they are, because psychologists, we love buzzwords. We love to come up with phrases and buzzwords for things that describe what people already know through common sense. So I'm going to be talking about two general ideas: social emotional learning skills, or SEL skills, as people oftentimes refer to them, and executive functioning skills. Like I said, there's a great deal of overlap, but I want to go through each of them separately because there are some slight differences, and because there are very different kinds of programs that we might see in schools and even in games where we might see these skills being more useful than others. So let's first of all define what it means. So when we talk about these social emotional learning skills, we're talking about the skills for understanding and managing emotions and behaviors. And there's, again, compelling data both for this and for executive functions that if we can teach these skills to young children, that they will learn better in school. And I'm not just referring to learning better to get along with each other. I'm talking about learning more reading skills, learning better in math, because what they're going to do is they're going to learn some of these skills to sort of manage themselves, to work with other people, to be engaged in group projects. So all these skills really lead to learning and to healthier human beings, for that matter. And so that's part of why these are so important, and why if we can use games to improve these skills, it's very important. So there are 5 major competencies in social emotional learning. Okay, we've got self-awareness, which is really an understanding of one's feelings and skills. Social awareness, kind of a recognition of others' feelings and thoughts. self-management, regulation of one's feelings and actions, relationship skills, sort of the ability to connect, to empathize with others, and decision-making skills, the capacity to evaluate and assess situations. And these skills are particularly important when we think about those 21st century skills that President Obama has identified around collaboration, communication, being able to do group projects, and improving creativity. Social emotional learning skills are really important when we think about the kind of play that kids get involved in as well. So where do we see social emotional learning skills in gameplay? So some games require self-awareness, where you need to examine your strengths and weaknesses. Other games involve social awareness, so depending upon another to improve in a game. These are oftentimes seen in online games, for example. In many online games, you really need to know what someone else's skills are, what their particular strengths are, or perhaps for that matter, what they've collected in their armaments or in their storehouses. Connect relationship skills. This is important in games where there's creations of clans, where there are teams, where there are guilds, and you have to be able to get along with people. SEL is seen in gameplay when people are managing their emotions, just handling their frustration. Decision making. How do they use new items? How do they evaluate situations? So there are a couple of there are many games where these skills are really important. The game Super Better, some of you may be familiar with that, developed by Jay McGonigal. It's a game that helps with connectedness when players share support and empathy and encouragement with each other. Civilization 5 is another example of where some type of self-awareness is required. You have to kind of have strategies and tactics. They may take a while to develop. You need to decide whether they're healthy. You have to kind of re-examine them. Self-awareness is, we might think about that as a skill that psychologists will refer to as metacognition, thinking about one's thinking. All right, let me shift over to executive functions. And again, I'm using both of these terms here and I really want to talk about how can we use games to improve social emotional learning executive functions. And I'm separating them, but again, I want those of you who are not psychologists to think about these skills as something that really have a lot of connections with each other. Executive functions, again, another big buzzword in the field of psychology. If you went onto Google to look at and see how many studies and articles were written about executive functions, say in 1995, by 1995, you might find 100 or so. If you look now, you'd find 5,000 or 10,000. It's just a huge area, one that we're using now to explain specifically things like attentional problems, learning problems. We're really looking at these executive functions. So what are they? So executive functions are brain-based skills. For a long time, we thought that they were brain-based and fixed capacities located in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. But now we're recognizing that because the brain is plastic and it can actually change, that the best way to look at executive functions is as skill sets. They're brain-based self-management skills. They are, some people like to call them the cognitive control center of the brain. Some people like to use a metaphor of like the conductor of an orchestra, that executive functions allow us to sort of prioritize, to figure out what to pay attention, what to put our effort into, how to organize ourselves, how to use planning skills. They really are the skill sets that allow us for independent, purposeful, goal-directed behavior. So I'll see a lot of kids, for example, and I'm sure you know some adults as well, who are brilliant, really smart, but they can't seem to get their life together. They can't be organized. They can't figure out what to do. They don't seem to prioritize. Sometimes they don't connect and understand each other or other people. So they get upset easily. They don't control their emotions. So these are all executive functioning skills that can play a role in people's difficulties. Now, what I'm going to do is show you a list of some of these executive functioning skills, and this is based upon a model by Peg Dawson and Richard Gere. I mention them because they're school psychologists, And the way that they came up with their model was based upon what they see in schools, and then they looked at these skill sets that could help kids to improve what they could do in school. Working memory is one of the most important ones. So here's a list of some of the skills that they have. And again, there's some interrelationship even amongst these kinds of skills. So for example, if you think about the idea of time management and organization as a skill, there's a couple of other skills that are not in this list, like planning. Those skills are all interrelated, okay? So task initiation, getting started on things, sustained attention, sustained focus, if you will. Task persistence, that's kind of that, willingness to keep working at things, as hard as you can. So there's a lot of different kinds of skills that we're looking at when we talk about executive functions. And what we're going to see here is how these skills, play a role in people's functioning, okay? And how we see them in gameplay. So, for example, the executive function skill of planning is frequently, we see it all the time, anticipating enemy attack in a first-person shooter. Working memory skills. Recalling a series of battles and a series of moves in a battle. If you're playing a racing game, remembering what happened when you went around the track in a particular location. Flexibility is a skill that's required in a lot of video games. You need to change your approach. So you're on level 1, and in order to beat this level, you have to jump over something. But level 2, you've got to find a new tactic, and what you did before puts you in the pond, as opposed to help you getting over it. Self-awareness skills, learning from one's mistakes, being able to step back, learn. Good video games require that you make mistakes. That's the only way you can improve in a good video game. You go do something, you make a mistake, you go back and you say, what else could I do? You have to kind of be aware of that. Self-control, you have to control your frustration, organization. It's, in many games that are you have to manage your inventories and collect things and know what you need to do to get from one level to another. So these executive skills are used in many games. Some of the ones that I didn't mention here are time management. Many games require that you know how much time you have to achieve something. There's a lot of the best video games require these kinds of executive functioning or problem-solving skills. In fact, the games that kids like are not the easy games where they're not cognitively challenged. The games that kids like best are the games that they really have to think about things. So this next part here is about some of the research that supports the idea that there are executive functioning and thinking skills that are used in games. So the first thing is we did some work on our own in this area at LearningWorks for Kids. What we found is we targeted some games that practice specific skills that we had identified prior to that. In other words, my staff played the games. We identified that, for example, a game might be using a planning skill, and then we targeted those games to kids who had weaknesses in those areas. We did some pre and post measures, and we found that, in fact, the kids made significant improvements in the areas that we targeted and didn't improve on areas that we didn't target. There's other research that suggests a combination of board and video games can improve fluid reasoning and processing skills. This is the Mackey data. One of the studies that's really interesting in looking at how games can improve working memory is the study on the bottom of this page by Dovis. And Dovis, what they did is they studied kids. This was done over in Great Britain, and they were trying to look at kids with ADHD to see if they could improve their working memory. And so there were some kids that they just did some working memory training. There were other kids where they put the working memory training into a video game, so it was kind of a video game-like training. And there were other kids that they gave 20 euros to each time they did these kinds of things. So they were paying the kids to see how well they would do. They were playing games, and they had a kind of control setting. So the kids who were the control setting did not show any improvement. However, the kids who played the games made a great deal of improvement, and the kids who got paid made the improvement. So the traditional training, there really wasn't a control. There was a control group to it. There was a kind of the traditional training on working memory was not very successful in improving these symptoms of working memory in kids with ADHD, but the game-like approach was. We see similar findings in other kinds of psychological or neuropsychological tests. For example, there's a test called the Wisconsin card sorting test, where if kids who have executive functioning issues do the traditional cards sort, which is actually literally with cards, they do far more poorly than if they do the computerized version. Just putting on a screen and making it into a game improves things dramatically. So how do we think about this in terms of how games and apps, for that matter, how can they improve executive function? So this is our conceptualization at LearningWorks for Kids. We see games as being a tool for practicing these skills. So, for example, if you play Angry Birds, and we'll look at that in a minute, you need to be flexible because things change. The rules of the game change over the course of time. You need to be able to practice that skill, and you need to be able to, and you repeatedly become more flexible. With apps, and I'm talking about apps that might help with organizing, with scheduling, things like that. Those are places where the skill is sort of scaffolded by the functionality of the app. So in other words, you might not get better at organizing, but if you get good at using this particular app, you might be able to be more organized. When we talk about mastery, popular games can sometimes help with mastery of these executive functions and the social emotional learning skills. If there's something built in to the game that helps for both practicing but also for generalizing. How do you going from the game to the real world? So let's talk about a few games where we see executive function and social emotional learning skills used on a regular basis. So Minecraft is an unbelievable game for these kinds of skills, for both of them. I mean, it's obviously an unbelievable game in terms of what kids are seeing in today's world, and apparently Microsoft must have seen it as an unbelievable game to pay $2 million for it as well. But it's a remarkable game in terms of its complexity and in terms of the skills that it requires. You need to be flexible. Players need to learn to craft new objects. They have to arrange materials to fit the recipe of a desired item that they want to make. Minecraft also can create an infinite number of unique worlds. You can go and play it differently every single time. So you need to be flexible in terms of what's going to happen. You have to improvise. So you're using that flexibility skill. You need to be organized, okay? You need to be able to keep materials safe, and organization is helpful. So, for example, when kids are playing the game and they, especially when they're playing the survival mode, they may need to build big boxes to hold on to their stuff so that the creepers and the other predators don't get to their stuff. Time management is important. What happens in Minecraft is if you don't get certain things done by the time the night comes, you could be in trouble. So you really need to look at that. You have to understand the game cycles in order to be effective. It also helps with connecting in relationships. Playing Minecraft together is really common. Coordinating together in Minecraft requires teamwork, and I would say that talking and working together in Minecraft is a very common phenomenon. A very cool thing for some of you may know about this. Some of you may know about the Quest to Learn School in New York City. And I think there's one now in Chicago as well. Katie Salin's school. Well, Katie and a few other people, and I'm blocking on their names right now. Ito, that's her last name. Put together a camp for the summer for kids to play Minecraft together. So the kids all go together with the idea of developing some problem-solving skills, and they all go on a server together with a number of counselors. So that connection and relationship, that planning and group decision-making are all right there for them in playing Minecraft. And it's a very powerful game. This is just a picture of a playbook what we have at LearningWorks for Kids that describes what Minecraft is and how it helps. And each of those tabs up above are things. These are essentially instructions for parents. This is kind of an educational technology tool that tells the parents how Minecraft helps with what skills, gives parents very specific strategies, and educators could certainly use this, and clinicians could use this as well, about how they could play together with a child. The Make It Work section is ways to use Minecraft and then have an activity that goes along with it in the real world And then we have a few other tabs there describing specifically how Minecraft can practice mathematics, and another how you might use it for a child who's diagnosed with autism, and another with how you might use it for a child who's diagnosed with ADHD. Angry Birds Go, another game. So this is one of the series of many of the Angry Birds games. Angry Birds is, many people just look at Angry Birds as just being kind of a fun game that doesn't have a whole lot that's built into it, but it's really cognitively challenging. You need to be flexible. With each new level, you're constantly challenged to adapt to the different twists and turns in the game in Angry Birds Go. You need focus. You need to set goals. You need to work persistently. You need to sustain your attention and effort. Angry Birds Go is a little bit different from some of the other Angry Birds games. Time management is also required, where you need to each level is timed, so you have to be aware of that, and you have to get through the level quickly. So you're using a variety of these executive functioning skills, and again, you're practicing these skills. And I want to emphasize that. What we're talking about here is how you practice these skills in the game. The big question that we're going to try to address in just a bit is how do we transfer those skills that you're practicing in the game to the real world? How can we do that most effectively now? How might we do it most effectively in the future? Those are questions that I would like people to puzzle over and think about. And hopefully, we've got a couple of answers here, and I'm hoping other people will come up with even more answers. This is a really fascinating game. It's called If. This game was made specifically to improve social emotional learning skills. This game is the brainchild, if you will, of Trip Hawkins, who is the founder of Electronic Arts. Trip's, from what I understand, Trip's kids went to a school where social emotional learning was a very important component of the school curriculum, and the kids were learning tremendous kinds of things academically and socially and emotionally. And they decided to kind of make a game to improve social emotional learning skills. It's probably a game that's suited for younger kids for the most part. You can see that people have kind of compared it to like a Pokemon-like game. What's interesting about this game is that the game breaks through the fourth wall. In other words, it talks to the player about skills that they could develop to handle difficult situations. So in If, we'll see that kids use self-control skills, where they'll encounter many scenarios that require managing their frustration and understanding how to control their emotions. It uses self-awareness skills, where they need to be collaborative and they need to be empathic towards others. Cooperation is a major theme in the game. And what's cool about the game, again, is that these skills are embedded right in the game, and in the game it teaches you, for example, to do some breathing techniques to relax. It helps to it teaches kids how to listen and kind of respond to someone as well. So embedded within the game are these social emotional learning skills. So one of the questions that we have is, why would we use games to want to improve some of these kinds of skills? I mean, why not just try to teach them in a more traditional fashion, like, have a classroom teacher or a school psychologist come in and teach these social emotional learning skills? Well, part of it is, as you can see in this picture, is that games and technology make kids' brains work. They really do. And we want to capture that. I mean, part of what got me interested in this whole field was I'm looking at all these kids who are struggling, who aren't learning their math or their reading, and they're not paying attention. But when it came to games and technology, they were so engaged that it was an opportunity for learning. And so the question for me is, how do we make that happen? What do we do about that? So here are some of the reasons. I mean, we want to use these games and technology because the kids are engaged. Okay, I actually have a word for it. I call it engagement, as opposed to engagement. I just put an M, where the G would be, and I call it engagement. And when kids are engaged, they're cognitively immersed. There's a sense of flow where they're just there and not even thinking about something else. Effort doesn't mean anything to them. They're just totally engaged and there. And it's a real opportunity to kind of use that thinking to get them to learn some stuff. Using games and technology makes sense. We're catching kids with what they're doing already. Why don't we use what they're doing already? They're very willing to practice, okay? They love talking about and thinking about these games. They're playing. And by the way, let's go back to the first thing we talked about today, which is play equals learning. When the kids are playing, they are learning. And many of the best games teach us how to play the games. And when a game teaches you how to play the game, it's really requiring that you use these executive function of problem-solving skills. You're figuring out problems when you're learning to play the games. Problem is that most of the games we have today just aren't enough. Okay? The fact is that most games teach skills really well in the game. They teach some of those skills pretty well if you're playing in a similar game, and there might be some modest level of what we call transfer. We might actually, specifically, we talk about it as being what we call near transfer to skills that are like what you use in the game. But right now, there's only limited data that it really expands to a lot of other kinds of skills outside of the game. And so part of what we need to do is we need to develop methods of mediation to go from the game to the real world, whether that be from a teacher, from a parent, or some kind of embedded instruction in the game to make that happen. And because actual learning requires knowledge of the skill, but more so than knowledge of the skill, but an understanding about how to use it, when to use it, and the capacity to use it across situations with many different people in many different settings. There's been some research to look at these kinds of issues. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the working memory game Cogmed Working Memory Training. There have been 70, 80 studies on that. There have been, like I said, these are peer-reviewed studies, but there have been some meta-analysis of the data. And the data questions how effectively is this pretty intensive game transferring these working memory skills to the real world. There's some supportive data, but there's other data that doesn't support it as well. So I think that that's one of those things that we really need to look at. And the key about all this is generalization. Generalization, taking something that you know in one setting and knowing it to another. It's really what I would say the holy grail of learning. In fact, it's really what a classroom teacher needs. A classroom teacher, if they're teaching math, they can teach math in the classroom, but if the kid can't go and apply it in some other setting, it doesn't help. Same thing as a coach who's teaching kids soccer. They go to practice, they play soccer, but can they take it to the game and put it into effect when it's happening, and when it's happening quickly, and they have to make decisions. It's applying a skill learned in one place and putting it into another. It's using different materials to do the same kinds of things. So these games are teaching, but they're not necessarily always helping us to apply these skills in another place. So one of the ways that we've begun to look at games at LearningWorks for Kids is we look at the games as a teaching tool. As opposed to saying this game will teach these skills, we think about the game practicing the skills and as a tool for getting kids engaged in wanting to learn and to teach. As I was saying before, they're a beautiful tool for that because of the level of engagement, interest, willingness to talk, attention, persistence, all those types of things really make games a terrific place for learning and a terrific tool for learning. Here's a slide that just, this is a little bit too much psychology, so I won't spend much time with this. But basically, I wanted to define generalization for you because I think that this is such a core concept for where we need to go with games in today's world, particularly with serious games. When we're talking about serious play and serious games, what we really need to do is we need to say, how can we take what people are using in these games and make these into real-world skills that will be helpful to them? So, I want to talk again a little bit more about why do we want to use these games, okay? Well, we said before that kids talk about them. Games are social. Games get kids to think. The persistence is important. They're motivational. And they promote a lot of practice. It's not hard to get, if you give kids homework that consists of playing a game and talking about it, I bet you 90% of them will do it, maybe more. That's very different from when you give them math homework. So how do we take game-based learning and make it into real-world learning? So One model to look at is something developed by SharpBrains. For those of you who know SharpBrains, they are kind of a consulting firm that looks at the brain fitness areas and the kinds of technologies that are being used now in brain development, in improving executive functioning skills and educational skills. So they have actually a 5-step model, and I actually include the 6th step. But basically what they say is the best way to do this is to target a specific brain-based skill. So if we really want to take a skill, like one of these executive functioning skills, we need to target something specifically. So let's not just say, let's improve executive functions. Let's say, let's improve this person's organizational skills. Then we need to target that area with a specific tool, again, with a technology or tool that actually practices or is designed to improve organizational skills. We need to make the games or the tools adaptive. Well, that's what video games are. They get increasingly harder. They match level of challenge to the mastery. So if you're at the mastery level 10, you're going to get the level of challenge at 11. You're going to kind of keep going and moving up. That's how games are. They're adaptive. They get harder as the person makes progress. You need to have enough intensity and duration. So SharpBrains talks about if you're really going to do this with video games to help people, you need to maybe spend someplace between 10 and 20 hours with a series of games that are focused on a particular skill. You need to have long-term maintenance training. You need to practice after you've developed the skill. So it's kind of like if you want to get better in playing soccer by, let's say, running and doing sprinting. Then, if you want to maintain it, you may not have to do the intensity of sprinting that you did at the beginning of your training, but you need to keep doing it over the course of time. And the 6th step is the one that we add to when I was kids, is that generalization training, doing activities that really practice and promote those skills outside of the game. We really think at this point most games don't have those capacities embedded in them, so we need to do it outside of the game. So the model that we use in LearningWorks for kids is steeped in strategic teaching principles that are based upon a lot of research in psychology. So these kinds of principles involve things like setting goals with the child, partnering with the child to want to do this, previewing the skills that they're going to do so that they have this kind of cognitive or metacognitive understanding of what they're going to do, and getting them engaged in and having them wanting to work hard in this, individualizing it to a child's needs, finding teachable moments. These are all specific skills that we look at. You need to customize the process so kids understand that. You need to kind of be reinforcing. I mean, the metacognitive piece is so important, stepping back and thinking about it. And while I said a whole pile of words just now, we summarize it with 3 words, which is detect, reflect, connect. What we want kids to be able to do is we want them to be able to identify or detect a skill in a game, to think about the skill in the game and how it might help them in the real world, or be reflective, and then to connect it to real-world activities, to actually do something in the real world. And that's each of the games that we've reviewed and the apps that we review. We've written what we call playbooks or app guides, probably for 800 or 900 games and apps, popular games and apps. And so we tell parents and educators and clinicians about how to do this with each game. So it's essentially a curriculum for each game about how to take that game and make it into a game that can teach kids skills. So if we're going to do this, in the future, I think that one of the things we want to do is we want to think about, can we embed some of this teaching into games? That would be great. Now, one of the things that I'm involved in, and I think some people may be very interested in, something called the iThrive Project. This is being funded through a grant from the Dorothy Batten Foundation. The iThrive Project is an interesting project where what we're trying to do is find game makers or find existing games that can help teenagers use technology to improve their positive psychology skills. Positive psychology skills, again, another one of those kind of psychological buzzwords, things like optimism, connectedness with others, being able to be resilient. So these kinds of skills, again, very similar to what we're talking about, we're trying to, in the iThrive Project, we're trying to develop and maybe alter some existing games that can enhance those types of skills. And what we want to do is we want to build some of this stuff right into the game itself. Effective game-based learning sometimes requires practice of these skills in the real world. Sometimes means going outside of the game in order to do so. It might mean even watching videos about the game. So one of the things that we're doing at LearningWorks for Kids is we're developing Let's Play videos, which, for those of you who don't know, are those things that kids are watching on YouTube every single day, watching somebody else play a video game. And what we're doing is we're developing Let's Play video games that are fun, that help them to, for example, learn how to do things in Minecraft and a lot of other popular games. But we're also teaching them a little bit about the skills that they're using in the game. So if they're building something, let's say they're building a house in Minecraft, and they need to figure out the materials they need. So we'll actually tell them, well, let's plan that out. We'll put planning in the Let's Play video and tell them a little bit how they're planning, how they need to do a little bit of planning in order to make this happen. And at some point in the Let's Play video, we'll actually kind of comment that kind of planning might help them in the real world if they had a project at school or something else like that they needed to plan out. Another idea is using games where we've got coaches in the games themselves to help the kids recognize the skills that they're using, kind of like the Minecraft camp that they're doing right now through Quest to Play. So we can build it into the games, and when we do that, like if, for example, is a great place to do that, we're also building some of these skills into, I don't know if I want to call Achille and these other potential tools as games, but we're building some of these things into tools that may help kids to improve focus and attention and different kind of executive functioning skills. We can see a little bit of this in Lumosity and other brain training tools, but these are limited, and the critics of these tools are pretty vocal at this point. So there are some limitations, and I want to just talk about those. But hopefully, what people will be leaving this thinking about is how many of the games we have now are terrific for practicing these executive functions and social emotional learning skills. And at this point, the key strategy, I think, is to figure out how do we generalize those skills from the game to the real world. And right now, I think we need parents and educators, clinicians, and other practitioners to help that. But I'm hoping that over the course of time that game makers will find some ways to build some of these sort of transferable skills into the game more effectively while keeping the game fun. That's the key. So there are some limitations right now. We don't have a lot of peer-reviewed research that helps us to understand how games are improving executive functions. Some of the skills that are being used in games are maybe less focused, less intensity, and very few of the games have this capacity for embedding the strategies for generalization. So I hope you've learned something from this today. If anyone would like to contact me, please feel free to contact me at randy@learningworksforkids.com. And I'm hoping that you can pass the word on about this to help educators and clinicians and other people who are working with serious play and serious games to recognize that these powerful skills, executive functioning skills and social emotional learning skills, which are so crucial for learning, can be developed through gameplay. Thank you.
Randy, that was just terrific. I learned a lot, and I would love to chat with you more about this. I'm hoping that some of the first studies that you've seen that are showing how games are helping kids learn, that you can share some of the context with that with me, because I keep getting asked to go out and explain why we're so important, the serious games industry. But I thought this was terrific. I really want to thank you for participating, and I'm glad you're going to be a speaker next week. I think there's going to be a lot more people interested in you at the conference, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sue, for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I think it's a tremendous area and tremendous field at this point, and it's incredible how many great speakers you have coming to the